Thank you so much for having me. I apologize. The electricity went out at my house, and so I've been forced to come back to the office to record this in advance of the presentation so that you'll have something to listen to. I apologize. I have to do this virtually, and I have to do it in advance, but I hope you enjoy what I have to say. In December 2024, Sam Altman tweeted this. Algorithmic news feeds, he said, are the first at-scale misaligned AIs. Now, I want to make 2 points about what Sam said. First, to emphasize just how right he is, and second, to argue just how wrong he is, meaning how screwed we are, or how screwed that means democracy is. So let's start with number 1, how right he is. AI in the 2024 election in America mattered in 2 ways. It had intended effects and it had byproduct effects. The intended effects we could divide into 2, foreign actors sowing dissent. So there were fake Russian news sites. There were efforts to impersonate Americans using bot farms on Twitter. There were sites generated by Russian LLMs that were spread in news deserts in the United States. Those are the foreign examples. And then domestic actors tried desperately to use AI. The Democratic Party was successful using it to drive fundraising. Donald Trump was embarrassed trying to use it to suggest that Taylor Swift had endorsed him. Some candidates used it in a clever way to make their ads a little bit more compelling. Some used it in a ridiculous way. Here's one example.
It is me, Martin Luther King. I came back from the dead to say something. As I was saying, I have another dream. That Anthony Hudson will be Michigan's 8th district's next congressman. Yes, I have a dream again.
Fear not, he did not become the next congressman. Okay, so the point is, if this is the AI that was in our elections, at least domestically, I agree with MIT that the suggestion was overblown. This was not the year of AI. Okay, but AI's effect was not through the intended effects. AI's effect was through the byproduct effects of new media, or more precisely, social media. This is Tristan Harris, who was an engineer at Google before he left to start the Center for Humane Technology. You may have seen him in The Social Dilemma. He studied the science of attention, the effort to engineer attention, to overcome resistance, to increase engagement on platforms of every social media variety. It's a kind of brain hacking, as he puts it. Now, what's brain hacking? Well, think of maybe something more familiar, body hacking. This book by Michael Moss, Salt, Sugar, Fat, describes the food science that exists in the processed food industry, a science to engineer food to find the perfect mix of salt, sugar, and fat, to exploit evolution and overcome the natural resistance so you cannot stop eating the food so that they can sell food better. This is what we could call body hacking. Brain hacking is the same thing with respect to attention. It's the effort to exploit evolution, the fact that we are irrationally responsive to random rewards, or we can't stop consuming bottomless pits of content, with the aim to increase engagement to sell ads. It's a business model. Call it the engagement business model, and AI drives it. That business model creates incentives for the business, as Shoshana Zuboff describes in her book, The Incentive to Know More, not just by watching us, but by poking us, tweaking us, asking us questions, rendering us vulnerable, reaching down the brain stack to leverage our insecurities so as to better sell ads. And in so doing this business model imposes externalities on us and on the world. As Zeynep Tufekci puts it, the companies are in the business of monetizing attention, and not necessarily in ways that are conducive to health or the success of social movements or the public sphere. Because it just turns out, too bad for us, that the best strategy, the most profitable strategy to drive engagement is the politics of hate. We engage more. The more extreme, the more polarizing, the more hate-filled the content is. AI learns that And so that is what we fed. AI learns that. Or does it learn that? This book by Stuart Russell describes the way AI works in social media. He says the algorithms function in social media. They aren't particularly intelligent, but they are positioned to affect the entire world because they directly influence billions of people. Typically, such algorithms are designed to maximize click-through. That is the probability that the user clicks on the presented items. The solution is simply to present items that the user likes to click on. Right? Wrong. Wrong, he says. The solution is to change the user's preferences so that they become more predictable. A more predictable user can be fed items they are likely to click and thereby generate more revenue. People with more extreme political views tend to be more predictable in which items they will click on. Possibly there's a category of articles that die-hard centrists are likely to click on, but it's not easy to imagine what this category consists of. Like any rational entity, the AI, the algorithms, learn how to modify the state of its environment, in this case, the user's mind, in order to maximize its own reward. Changing preferences is the obvious strategy. And changing political preferences was what, in fact, we have seen. This book by Max Fisher tracks the studies in the United States and in Brazil and in Britain and in Germany that demonstrate that the spread of social media is equated with the increase in radicalization of the public in each of these four countries, because the AI is radicalizing them to increase engagement. This is a byproduct of the engagement business model. And as Renee DiResta puts it, the former director of the Internet Observatory at Stanford, in her book, Invisible Rulers, this produces for individuals bespoke realities. Each of us live in our own bubble, fed the information we want to be fed so that we can believe what we want to believe. As Barack Obama puts it, if you watch Fox News, you're in one reality, and if you read the New York Times, you're in a different reality. So, for example, this event on January 6th, really a shocking event in the United States when protesters tried to, quote, stop the steal by marching on the Capitol. The thing to remember about those protesters is that they believed something. More than 70% of Republicans said they agreed that Donald Trump's contention that he received more votes than Donald Trump, and than Joe Biden. And this was not just the uneducated. A majority of Republicans with college degrees said they believed the election results were fraudulent. So 70% of Republicans mean about 30% of Americans believe the election was stolen. Now that graph is frightening enough. This graph is much more frightening, because what this shows is that in the period since January 2021 to today, these beliefs have not changed. The same number of people believe today that the election was stolen as believed it in 2021. Now, I suggest this is something new. Think back to when Richard Nixon had to resign the presidency in 1974 because he was threatened with impeachment. Nixon had won his election overwhelmingly in 72. He was a popular candidate in 72. He was not such a popular candidate in his first term, but this graph shows his popularity among different groups. So the red line is Republicans, the blue line is Democrats, and the middle line is independents. Now, the striking thing about this graph is that in the period leading up to his resignation, as the story of Watergate was told, Nixon's support collapses at the same rate among these three distinct groups. All three were watching the same news, and all three groups accepted the same reality that they had a president who had likely committed a crime. They were not living in bespoke realities, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They lived in a common reality, what we used to just call reality. Now contrast that with Donald Trump's approval rating across the whole of his first term. Notice it never changes, even though he was in fact impeached twice. It doesn't change among Republicans. It doesn't change among Democrats, because all of these groups are living within their own bubble of reality, their own bespoke reality, listening to what they want to hear and understanding and believing the world is as they are told it is. This, I suggest, is the new normal. And it bespokeness begets or optimizes for what we could call fantasists. People who just utter whatever they want to believe and repeat it enough and believe the world will come to believe as they say the world should believe. So we are led in our government by three fantasists: RFK Jr., my President Donald Trump, Elon Musk. RFK, who has created all sorts of uncertainty around fluoride, leading some cities to remove fluoride from the water. The president who said that immigrants were eating pets. Elon Musk, who said he was going to cut $2 trillion from a $6 trillion budget. This is all crazy talk, at least for us. It has no connection to reality, at least to our reality, or I'll say to my reality, to my bespoke reality. And just for the record, I looked it up. My bespoke reality is real. Okay, now the consequence of this is that we live in these bubbles cemented with hate, and we the people become we the polarized, ignorant, and angry. This is AI. This is the AI driving the algorithmic feeds. And this is the AI that we should be focused upon. Now, the point here is that this is not about technology. It is about a business model. It is about the byproduct of a business model that produces the algorithmic news feeds, making the democracy infinitely worse. And in this sense, that is why Sam Altman was right, that they were the first at-scale misaligned AIs. Okay, here's why he is wrong. Because they take this statement, the first at-scale misaligned AIs. Misaligned? In what sense misaligned? Because what is the AI's objective? The engagement business model, to get people engaged. And is the result that the news feeds produce aligned with the objective of the engagement business model for each of these social media platforms? Of course it is. And not only is it, the fact that it is aligned is recognized despite it being inconsistent with values that we would otherwise support. So this is Andrew Bosworth in a memo that he wrote just before the 2020 election to Facebook employees who were troubled by the anxiety they felt about this election in 2020 being affected by Facebook's algorithms. And Andrew Bosworth invokes the story from Salt, Sugar, and Fat to defend Facebook's policy not to interfere with the engagement algorithm. As Bosworth writes, "What I expect people will find is that the algorithms are primarily exposing the desires of humanity itself, for better or worse. This is a sugar, salt, fat problem." He got that title wrong, but put that aside. The book of that name tells a story ostensibly about food, but in reality about the limited effectiveness of corporate paternalism. A while ago, Kraft's Food had a leader who tried to reduce the sugar they sold in the interest of consumer health. But customers wanted sugar. So instead, he ended up reducing Kraft's market share. Health outcomes didn't improve. That CEO lost his job. The new CEO introduced quadruple stuffed Oreos, and the company returned to grace. Giving people tools to make their own decisions is good, but trying to force decisions upon them rarely works for them or for you. Remember, he's talking to Facebook employees. And then he goes on, "At the end of the day, we are forced to ask what responsibility individuals have for themselves. Set aside substances that directly alter our neurochemistry unnaturally. Make costs and trade-offs as transparent as possible. But beyond that, each of us must take responsibility for ourselves. If I want to eat sugar and die an early death, that is a valid position. My grandfather took such a stance towards bacon, and I admired him for it. And social media is likely much less fatal than bacon." Well, first of all, is that true? I think social media has done much more harm in my family than bacon certainly has. But the point here is he's arguing that this is not a Facebook problem, even though Facebook designed the platform to create this negative effect. Even though it's a democracy problem, it is not a Facebook problem. This might be misaligned socially, this might be misaligned democratically, but it is corporately aligned. The engagement business model is privately beneficial, but publicly not. Privately profitable, but publicly demos destroying. Okay, now when you see it like this, there's really something quite astonishing about this, because it is just a business model, just one way to make money over another. And when you think about it like that, I think that if you told me, for example, the only way to end climate change was to threaten and weaken democracy, I wouldn't agree with you, but I would understand the trade-off. Or if you told me the only way to end world hunger was to weaken or damage democracy, I wouldn't agree with you again, but I would understand the trade-off. But when you tell me we have to damage and weaken democracy just so these people can get richer, I don't even know what you are talking about. Okay, so what is to be done? You may know this movie called A Quiet Place, which is about these aliens who invade with extraordinarily ravenous appetites, but with one important handicap: they cannot see. So the only way they know who to attack is through sound, which forces all humans to move into a life that is completely silent. They move life underground, and when they're above ground, they have to maintain total silence. Because if they don't, they will be destroyed. Now, I want you to see this as a metaphor because it's the same which is true for us or for our democracy. An AI has invaded us, not an alien intelligence, but an artificial intelligence. And when the flood is coming, the thing we must do is to move to higher ground, to protected ground, to insulate democracy, shelter democracy from AI's force, from AI's harmful force. And that means to think about how to protect it when we know it won't be protected in the electoral process. David von Rehbuch's fantastic book, Against Elections, begins with this passage. He says, for almost 3,000 years, people have been experimenting with democracy, and only in the last 200 years have they practiced it exclusively by holding elections. And he says this is changing because we're seeing the rise of a citizen assembly movement all around the world. Movements that support random, representative, informed, and deliberated bodies, protected bodies, complementing, not replacing representative democracy, but giving the people a way to do democracy that is sensible. Iceland crowdsourced a new constitution. Ireland has an annual event producing policy changes like regulations about abortion decriminalized and same-sex marriage ratified, two changes the Irish Parliament would never have adopted. France has now regularly adopted these citizen assemblies, the first one around climate change. None of these were perfect, but they are all extraordinarily hopeful. And I would say, or not and, I would say, but this is not just a good idea, not just a good idea for democracy, it is existential for democracy. Because there is no way to beat the engagement business model. This is a business model against democracy, and what we all need to do everywhere in the world that is vulnerable to this dynamic, we must move beyond the threat that the engagement business model produces now. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, or I'm assuming you listened to my talk, and again, I'm so sorry I can't be there to share in this conference. Thank you and good night.